First Thessalonians was the first letter that Paul wrote. And as a matter of fact, it's the first book of the New Testament to be written. So just kind of think about that with the context of those words. There were no written Gospels yet, no Acts of the Apostles. It was all still oral tradition with what people knew about Jesus. And they were beginning a new church. And they were under attack. They were not popular with the Jewish community of the time, who felt particularly threatened, much less the empire, right? So they were expecting that Jesus would return soon, and that's what Paul was addressing. Their need to be ready, to be prepared, and in the meantime, to continue to support each other, to hold each other up, be children of the light, live in the day, live with hope, keep living. So that's the message in that letter. Now we'll read from the Gospel of Matthew. It's very much connected. Jesus was at the end of his life. He's teaching his disciples. They had been asking about the second coming. When will you return? If you're going to really leave us, when will you return, and how will we know? And he had told them already in parables and in teachings. They wouldn't know. They just needed to be prepared. No one will know when the second coming will be. And in the earlier parables, he had told them to be faithful, to stay awake and watch. And now in this parable, he's telling them, yes, and by the way, keep living and take risks. Like those people in Thessalonica were taking a risk in just following Christ. Take risks with your faith. And so with that in mind, we'll read from Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the talents. Jesus said, "For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave.'" And I always think of the other words that we heard for this when I did when I was young. "Well done, good and faithful servant." So that's where that comes from. "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many, many things. enter into the joy of your master." Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." But his master replied, "You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own, with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For all those who have, more will be given, and they will have in abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away." We ask God's blessing on our reading, our hearing, our understanding, and our doing of this difficult message. Amen. I'm wondering how many of you have heard of Warren Buffett? Yeah, quite a few. Quite a few. Well, I'll fill in the lines a little bit here, and then you can check him out with whatever sources you have available. He was born in Omaha in 1930, and his father was a stockbroker and later a congressman. So he was given a lot. He was born with chance for good education, a lot of wisdom in the family on finances as well as law. His mother was a homemaker, so I think he had a very stable, loving home as well. So as a boy, he was a math whiz, and he liked the idea of investing in the stock market, like his dad. So throughout, starting at age 13, maybe even younger, I don't know, but he had a paper route, like a lot of kids. But then he came up with all kinds of interesting ideas as to how to make money. So that he came out of college, not a poor student, but he had money in the bank of his own. So he went from there, and we won't fill in all the years, but he founded the investment firm Berkshire Hathaway. And by the year 2006, he was worth $62 billion. Can't hardly imagine. 62 billion, kind of like the 10 talents. Huge amount of money a talent was. 15 to 40 years' wages for the average person was a talent. So here's Warren Buffett with all this money. So what did he decide to do with his money? Some of you probably know. In 2006, that same year, he decided to give it all away. All of it. He kept a little. He kept enough to live his modest lifestyle, which is what for his wealth, it's certainly modest. He had enough to live on, and remember, that was before the crash, so of course the money then kind of took a dive for a while, but it up and down. But 85% of that money he chose to give to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you can also check them out. You probably have. Another amazing couple of great wealth that are putting much, if not most of their wealth. Now, they live well as well, but they're doing things all over the world with their money and Warren Buffett's gift. They make sure that people have clean water. You know how much disease that prevents in the third world. They have projects all over for that, for solar power, for literacy in our inner cities, trying to break that cycle for kids, keep them in school. All kinds of other projects, basics like mosquito nets to prevent malaria, so a community can stay healthy and people can keep working and provide for their families. Now, another person that came to mind was Pleasant Rowland. And she's the next level. She's a woman from Middleton. And she grew up loving dolls, as many girls do. But she noticed that there was kind of a gap in the doll culture. So she decided when she was an adult to start a company that made dolls that taught girls and boys things, taught some history. So she started the American Girl Doll Company. And while, they were dolls that I couldn't afford, actually, to buy for my daughter, but she also gave them away. There were foundations and fundraisers and things. So right away from the start, when she was kind of small, she started her giving. But then as the company grew and it really took hold and she sold it to Mattel, she since then has dedicated her life to giving money, especially to children's charities and to things that will educate children in this area, in Dane County especially. And her latest project, at least the one I read about lately, was that she gave money to the Holy Wisdom Monastery out on the west side of Madison, the sisters out there, to buy a big chunk of land to preserve in prairie and natural woodland. And, the thing I thought about, she didn't say a word. She gave it privately. Just came out because she wanted to be at the dedication. But she lives pretty much next door there. And she could have bought that land for herself and set it aside. But then I was imagining she was probably concerned about who might follow her and buy her property. And giving it to the sisters, it would always be there for people, all of us, to use and enjoy and to preserve that piece of God's creation there for hopefully generations to come. And then there's another couple guys I remember named Bob and Irwin Goodman. Does some of you remember the commercials they used to do? I think it was Saturday evening programs. They often did their jewelry store commercials. Not great actors. Pretty dull commercials, but they did great things. They had a jewelry store on State Street. They were good employers, started small, made good money at the store. And even then, I've read stories about people like from when they first started the Depression, Second World War, if a soldier would come in for a ring, they knew what that meant. They practically gave that ring away. They'd always cut him a really good deal, not say a word about it. So they did that kind of thing in a small way, but then as their fortune grew, they didn't move. They stayed in their little apartment, really little apartment downtown. They never drove. They didn't buy cars, didn't buy much. They started giving their money away. They also have a foundation. They started, the first ones I became aware of, big ones anyway, were they're in their faith community. They're Jewish, and they gave a swimming pool to the day camp, for the Jewish day camp. I thought, oh, that's really nice. You know, they believe in their faith. But then it just grew from there. They helped build community centers all over Madison. One on the east side is named for them, so they funded a lot of that. The community centers, of course, serve people of all ages, all income levels, but especially the poor families where they're located. Have a place for kids to go after school to stay out of trouble. Programs for literacy, food banks, senior programs for the adults. And then one of their last big gifts, I think they help with the zoo as well, keep that free. But they also gave a big chunk of the swimming pool that was finally built on the south side in the neighborhood where kids cannot possibly afford a private pool membership. So one more story. I read this week, and some of you may have read this, it's in one of the papers, a story about a man named Perry Wallace. Now, Perry was the first black basketball player in the Southeastern Conference of the NCAA, the college basketball. And this was 1968. The first black in the whole conference. So he played for Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And even, being that far north and being in that school and being welcomed by the coach, at least, that was not easy, even on his own team. So one particular day, they were traveling, and they went to the University of Mississippi to play. So now he gets to go to the deep south. They always had their separate schools there, of course. Grambling, University of Mississippi, was not welcoming, to say the least. As soon as he got out on the floor, he played. He was good. He was taunted and he was threatened by the crowd and even by the people on the bench. So in the middle of the game, first half already, he was elbowed in the face. You know, those arms don't swing by accident a lot of times. This one particularly. So he had to stop. His vision was blurry and he was bleeding. No foul was called. The crowd was cheering. So he sat down on the bench and got an ice pack. So at halftime, they all went into the locker room, and he sat there with his ice pack on his eye, and nobody said anything. And they got their pep talk or whatever, and they all went back out on the floor. And he sat there by himself. He felt worn out. He was tired, trying to decide what to do. But he went back out. He went back out on the court. So a few years ago, a man who was a senior on that team, his name was Bob Warren, decided to go to Washington, D.C., where Perry Wallace is now a law professor at American University. So Bob looked Perry up, and he said to him, "Forgive me. There's so much more I could have done." he had been afraid. Jesus had told his disciples that he'd be leaving them. He was clear that they wouldn't know when he would come again, and they should just be live their lives in the meantime the way that he had taught, and be prepared. Kind of like the weather. We know winter's coming. We don't know when exactly, but it does come. Jesus will come again. But we should be prepared. Be prepared. So now we'll turn back to the parable for today. First, a quick history lesson, reminding you of the value of the talent. The value of the talent. So Jesus' audience knew when he said he gave this guy 5 talents. 60, 100 years worth of wages. And the next one got 2. And the one even without, according to their ability, as how, the master knew them. The last guy got 1. He had talent as well that he was to use. Also remember that slaves at that time, or servants, whatever word you like to use, a servant was not necessarily an uneducated person. They often had lots of education. They had lots of responsibility. Sometimes it was people that had gotten into some financial difficulty for whatever reason, and they went into servanthood, kind of an indentured servant kind of thing, and to work that off. The master would pay off their debt, and then they would work for a certain number of years. So these people had a lot of ability. So the first slave, like Warren Buffett, was good at investing. He followed the markets, and he knew the crop futures, and he knew the caravan schedule from Damascus, so he knew when to be there to be trading. He was a wise trader. And he doubled his money, and he gave it back to the boss. So also, as you're hearing these words, you've figured it out. Jesus, God, that's the boss. The boss is God. So then the second servant. Second servant was more kind of down to earth, more locally minded. But he was a real worker. And he had an idea. So he started a business with his money. He took that talent and he bought up inventory. He advertised and he did a great job, knew his product, and he doubled his money. He was able to sell his business and give the master twice the amount that he was given. And then there was the third servant, the third slave. And he had all kinds of excuses for not taking any risks. Jesus is talking about our abilities here and what we do with them, our opportunities. This guy had an opportunity and he buried it. Because mostly he was afraid. He made excuses. He blamed his master. It's your fault. Found somebody to blame. Now notice he wasn't dishonest. He gave the master back his coin and thought he was doing the right thing. But it's kind of like us saying, God, I don't have much. What can I do? like the basketball player, Bob, the older one, who was on the team with Perry Wallace, who let his fear guide his judgment. Bob knew what was right. Bothered him all those years. He knew what he should have done, but at the time, he had invested his talent for basketball, and he didn't want to lose his chance to play by taking a stand with his teammate. He buried his most important talent, and that was his humanity. He let a chance to really make a difference in someone else's life go by because he was afraid. Now, Jesus is acknowledging here that all of us aren't the same. We all have God-given talents. And we here today are really lucky that it's not risky in itself just to share the gospel. And we might get some odd looks. I mean, there aren't as many church-going people anymore, but it's accepted to be a Christian today in our culture. But Jesus is also clear that our actions are what speak for us. We are supposed to use our abilities and our money to give back to God. We don't have to worry about when Jesus is coming again. God will decide that. But as Paul said to his community, we're supposed to live as children of light, to use our talents to encourage each other and build each other up. Now, I don't think anybody here has billions or even millions to give away like our two big examples. But most of us are pretty talented, even though, we're kind of more one-talent people probably. We can't build community centers or swimming pools on our dime, but we have a lot. We have a lot compared to most of the world. And even small things can do a lot. We need to live, as Jesus said, day to day, doing the next right thing, taking a risk, not letting our fear drive us. So I want to tell you what happened with Perry and Bob. Bob had gone to ask Perry for his forgiveness. And Perry said, "We are fine. Don't think another thing of it. We were all just kids." He understood. He totally understood the fear of the time. And God understands our fears when it's hard to stand up. But let love win over fear. Take a chance on using your gifts in whatever ways you are able. God trusts us with so much. God trusts us to use all we have to spread the good news. And God's grace and joy are ours. So take them along, and you will do amazing things because you've got talent. Thanks be to God. Amen. Please bow your heads first for a moment of prayer, if we could.